These speakers are fantastic. Look, we've seen an extraordinary drought. In the last 20 years has been extraordinary. What I wanted to do here towards the end was I want to go back 100 years and maybe a bit more. Look at what the Darling and Macquarie was like then and to think, can it help us manage it better now? So, first of all, to go back more than 100 years, to go back tens of thousands of years, as Steve started with, Aboriginal people had a long and ongoing, strong cultural connection. And if you haven't been to Ngunu, the Brina fish traps, I suggest you go to there. It is an amazing site, and there's a museum there, and you have the guide will take you around. It is an extraordinary site on an international scale. So long history there. But with European people came huge change. And on the Darling, one of the big changes was the paddle steamers. And at Burke, to the extent we even had a navigation lock, 1897, and that was towards the end of the era and really only lasted another 15, 20 years after that. Now, there are the original navigation charts in the National Library in Canberra. These are actually online, and you can go to them and they reveal a huge amount. This is from about the 1870s, and you can see rocks, you can see deep channels. These here are not just indicative snags, they are individual snags plotted on the river, because that paddle steamer had to make sure he didn't hit one and lose his load. So these are individual snags. Now, as a fish biologist, I look at that and I think, wow, this is full of habitat. Absolutely full of habitat. Trees, rocks, deep channels, sandbanks. They're incredibly revealing. But they're also a massive risk for paddle steamers. And so snags were systematically removed. And in fact, there were rock bars, they were called reefs, they were named, and they were also blasted and rocks removed. And this was not just the odd snag taken out, the odd dangerous snag. This was very systematic. The New South Wales government funded it. This is the major trade route. This is where all the wool's going. Estimates are around 10 million New South Wales government spent on desnagging. From Wentworth to Brewarrina, systematically taking out every single snag. And this is probably by about 1890. So really, over 100 years ago, pretty well the snags have been taken out. So that's pretty revealing. So that's about habitat. So what was a Darling like before dams and irrigation? And you see these quotes. The Darling River at Menindee ceased to flow 48 times. Between 1885 and 1960, it didn't flow for 11 months in 1902. And paddle steamers were stranded for years. Now, when you see that, that gives the impression that the Darling is pretty well in a drought. It's just not flowing much. It's either zero or minimal flow. Not much is happening. It's a very erratic river. It's very variable. Well, some of those things are true. So I went back to the original data with a colleague, Brenton Zampatti, to this 1885 to 1960 data in the State Library in New South Wales, and looked at this to see if it was accurate. In fact, that is accurate. And that is accurate. That is exactly what happened. You can see the original flow records. But what is also true is that Darling flowed in that period for 92% of the time. And in fact, most of the time when it stopped flowing, actually, it was less than a month. If you saw those two facts, you'd have a very different image of the Darling. So we think of it as often as a desert river. It has long periods without flow. No, it's different to the Paroo. It actually flows most of the time. What about paddle steamers stranded for years? It'd be nice to go back in time and find out, what those stories were. Well, in fact, in a way you can. Because you can go back to the original newspapers, and those paddle steamers, where they were, was big news of the day. You know exactly what steamers arrived, at what town, when they left, what the master, the captain of the vessel was, and often what their load was. So you can actually plot where those paddle steamers went. So I've gone back and done this. They were never stuck for years. So what's happened is some myths have grown around this. One actually ended up on a floodplain between Burke and Warriner in a big flood, and of course it stayed up there and it was originally dismantled. But so this myth grew. They certainly were stuck for months, and certainly even in the Murray there was only navigation for 9 months of the year, but not for years. And what does stranded or stuck mean for a paddle steamer? Well, they were designed for pretty shallow depth, 3 foot, 900 mil. So, but the captains preferred, if they were loaded up, to have 4.5 feet depth. Now, they had to get over shallow rock bars at 4.5 feet. That actually, if you go back and look at the Darling at those rock bars, that's about 700 meg a day. That's actually a pretty good flow in the Darling. So for them, stranded meant less than 700 meg a day, not, oh, it's stranded, there's zero flow. So if you come back to here, no, they weren't stranded for years, and we're talking about potentially low flows are happening, good flows are happening at those times. So that's a very different picture. Now I want to zoom in to the Federation drought, the worst drought on record, although the present drought may equal it. But similar rainfall, similar inflows. 1895, 1903, this is Wilcannia, but Menindee, also no flow. A very, very severe drought. So I'm going to show you a bar graph. I'm going to go up the Darling. So Menindee, this is blue is flowing, and that blank is when it's not flowing, 1895 to 1904. So you can see that 11 months of no flow. You can see it there. What about further up the Darling? Well, it's the entire river. It is such a bad drought. The entire river is not flowing. So it's pretty severe. What about the tributaries? What about the Guada and the Namor? In fact, up the top there you can see that 1902 was a pretty bad year. They were also not flowing. What about the Macquarie? Well, you're not going to see that. I'll keep it one more time. This is what surprises me. The Macquarie never stops flowing in the worst drought on record. This is amazing. Now, it does stop it stops flowing in earlier droughts. During the gold rush period, when there's a big boom in the population, the upper catchment, there are times when it stops flowing. After this, there are droughts when it stops flowing and irrigation is taking off. But this is interesting. This says to me the Macquarie is probably a major refuge for the northern basin, and that's how we should be treating it. Have a look at these blue bars. This is a major drought, and yet down Menindee, it's still flowing 85% of the time. So this is a pretty severe drought, and the river is still going. So I'm going to compare the Federation drought with the Millennium drought. So half the time in the Federation drought, half the time it's flowing at 1,300 megalitres per day. And if you don't know what that looks like, it's about 1.5 metres deep at this site and flowing at a walking pace. That's a pretty good looking river. In the Millennium drought, half the time it's down to 70 megalitres per day. So this is a drought with similar rainfall, similar inflows. It's actually worse than that because 40% of the time it's only 5 megalitres a day. That's a trickle. That's about 6 inches wide and 6 inches deep. That's nothing. So this is a major change. Now that's a big change in flow, but the next statistic absolutely blows me away. So Federation drought, supposedly long periods of zero flow. Every 15 months, there's a flow pulse of 12,000 meg a day. That is astonishing. And that, in this river, would look something like this, 4 metres deep and a fast walking pace. So this is really rocking. Every 15 months in this drought. In the Millennium drought, that flow pulse every 15 months is down to 670 meg a day. So the Darling, to me, when we look at this data, is a very different sort of river, and that does tend to inform what we might do now. So why is this so different? Surely we can't compare these droughts. Well, yeah, it's a bit of similar rainfall. What's different? Fundamentally, our whole system's different, and Matt alluded to many of these impacts, but those major tableland dams, of course, capture flow, and they capture about 70% of the flow. And in the Barwon-Darling, 99% of that flow comes from the tributaries. Now, to show you what that sort of impact has, from August 2018 to November 2019, when we had dreadful fish kills, zero flows at Menindee and Wilcannia, 100,000 meg flowed into those dams. So that's, in one way, that's not surprising. That's not a statistic you've read about in the newspapers, but that's really how the dams are supposed to work. That's exactly what they're there to do. They're there to capture that flow. So the question more is, what do we do in the next drought? Do we manage it differently? So, you know, this is, yeah, again, I like, Cam, your tone that it's not about, I hear in the newspapers, oh, it's this cotton farmers or, this present New South Wales government. This is decades of decisions leading up to this point. This is whole communities. We all wanted this development. We all wanted, this resource, to be used. So all of us are part of the solution. So there's another subtler impact here. Everyone knows about the dams, but there's another subtle one. So this is 2 river gauges, upstream and downstream of Brewarrina. At the top, you can see some flow come in, up to 100 megalitres per day. This is the summer of the fish kills, and even up to 300 megalitres per day. And yet downstream gauge has got nothing. And the first instincts would be, oh, probably irrigation took this out. This is below irrigation thresholds. And what is between these 2 gauges is the Brewarrina weir pool. So in this weir, you can see when that flow comes in, actually what happens at first is the weir pool gets pumped out, obviously for water supply. People are drinking, having showers like myself. That water's been pumped out of the weir pool, and then when the flow comes in, the weir pool starts to fill up, it goes over the crest, and you get this little blip down here. Then you've got zero flow, and gradually you pump the weir pool out. And then when the next flow comes in, this little pulse comes in, it starts to fill the weir pool, but nothing passes. That is actually what the weir pool is supposed to do, actually. So again, that's like the dams. This is what we built in the 60s and 70s. This is what they're supposed to do. But what this does is soak up all those little pulses. So every single weir in the Darling in a drought does the same thing, and they all soak up these little pulses. So these town water supplies, they actually don't use much water. Irrigation uses the bulk of water, but they use it at the most critical time. So there is actually a solution to this, and it is giving the towns higher security, high quality water in off-stream storage. So they fill their off-stream storage when the river goes up, and then when the river goes down, they use their off-stream storage, but the river gets the low flows. Their ecological goal, they keep it ticking over. Those low flows are the major mitigation for blue-green algae, the major mitigation for fish kills. So I've got a couple of conclusions and then a couple of suggestions, but that de-snagging, absolutely, when I looked into that, I could not believe how much has been done. So that's absolutely massive, but it is completely recoverable. There's a really positive, side to this. And what is also amazing, the history shows you how valuable those base flows are in the Darling. Wow, they keep the river ticking over, they keep our fish populations ticking over, and right now, they prevent blue-green algae and fish kills. So there's 2 things to consider here. One, I think we need to start considering in the future, in the next drought, what do you do? As I say, this is a summary of decisions over many decades, but we're in a new spot here. We've got new information. We can manage it differently. So the dams have to be part of that solution, and I think we need to consider off-stream storage for towns. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.